Welcome to the Dialectic. I'm Atul Singh, the Rajput.
I'm Glenn Carl, the Wasp.
Today, Glenn and I will go down memory lane. And Glenn is not 200 years old, he's 500 years old. And so we'll go back 5 centuries and begin from the beginning. We are going to talk about the founding of America, starting from the Mayflower and how that first ship that landed, or one of the first ships that landed on American shores, still defines America's identity and culture. So, Glenn, a very warm welcome again. Tell us about the Mayflower.
Well, this is a dangerous assignment for me because fundamentally you're asking me to talk about myself, and so you will never be free, and I will be completely unaware of how I am spinning off into self-admiration and so on. So this is a dangerous assignment, but it is where I
You will be
it's
Narendra Modi for a wee bit, I suppose. He likes listening to himself.
okay. No, I have stayed in the Prime Minister's ashram, so I'm following in his footsteps humbly. Well, the story of America is stereotypical and trite in a lot of ways, and thus forgotten and being superseded by a new narrative. And that's a historically momentous shift that we are living, that some are aware of and exulting in, some are aware of and are resisting to the point of violence. And most people, I would say, are unaware of because, understandably, almost all of us live in the moment, in the present, without not just awareness, but even knowledge, consciousness at all of how we came to be, who we are, and where we are culturally and historically.
Well, if it is not on
Uh,
TikTok or Instagram or YouTube Shorts, it doesn't exist. That is the brave new world, Glenn.
it is the reality. I suppose it's always been the reality, absent, with allowance made for changes in technology. And one can only live in the moment because that's the present. We only have the present. However, the present is the accumulation of all of the past we've had. So what am I talking about? Before I get to the facts, I think a conceptual framework is really important. A society or a culture or a nation really can only cohere and exist and thrive if it has a broadly accepted narrative, a national cultural mythology, which will always be reductionist, always imperfect, always have those who are parts of the society who are left out. But that is critical to the existence of the sense of identity of and the purpose of, if there is a purpose, to a society. Even those who are left out, since they will frequently, almost invariably, define themselves in opposition to the dominant culture, which has left them out or doesn't agree with their own values or views or desires. Nonetheless, those who are left out or on the margins define themselves with respect to, often in opposition to, the dominant narrative. This is just a truth in human organization, certainly for America. So, what has the myth been of America? All my life and before, for all of American history, it's been that the European, which really meant the Englishman in the case of the United States, came to America and found a virgin land, a howling wilderness, in the words of one of the Mayflower leaders, that was provided really by a benign God to a chosen people to exploit in a positive sense. The negative connotations of exploitation only came really in my lifetime with regard to the environment and societies and so on, and developed for its own use. Now, of course, it's not just in vogue that's disparaging. We're very concerned today with the left out, what that meant for the Indians. And now it's not even acceptable to call them Indians, which is a sidebar we can get into. The Native Americans, or the First Nations, as they're called in Canada, peoples, because they, of course, had been here for anything from 12 to 16,000 years. Yeah. And they were swept away or killed over a course of 300 years.
If I can,
So that
if I can interject, the doctrine at the time was that if people were not using the land for productive purpose, if these people didn't have property rights in the same way as Europe did, if these people were not practicing intensive agriculture and industry and yada yada, they didn't really occupy the land. They were mere savages, and this land ipso facto was terra nulla, and therefore ready for exploitation in the positive sense of the word by God's chosen people. So this doctrine of terra
it was
nulla,
even sinful. Yeah, absolutely. It was even sinful not to exploit the land. What were these Indians doing? Nothing. And by doing nothing, they were not honoring their purpose or God's intention.
it was these Protestants with their Protestant work ethic who came over to North America and looked at these half naked savages and said, we must do better.
That's right. That's right. What's now viewed as hideous genocide, at least cultural genocide, which amounts to the same thing, of encouraging and obliging us what was called assimilation in an earlier generation, now considered to be a hideous genocide, as I said, then was viewed as compassionate and offering them a way forward. The choice for the Indians, in the view of the Europeans, fundamentally the English, who set the cultural shape of what became America, the United States, was they had a choice between inevitable extermination because they were overmatched, which was true, and therefore doomed and incompatible with modern, moral, progressive life, or they had a way forward, perhaps, of surviving by assimilating. The legacy of that cultural imperative and framework continued right up into my lifetime, which is 400 years, of course, after the arrival of my ancestors and the beginning of the American saga with the Mayflower, which I'll talk about in a second. I'll get into more facts and less meta conceptual in a moment, but these are really important concepts to the point where my wife, who is Chinese American, arrived in the United States at age 5 or 6. She's the same age I am, so we're talking, 60 years ago. And her name, she'll forgive me for mentioning her name, is Su Shen. Well, the teacher said, "What is your name, little girl?" or something like that. And she said, "My name is Su Shen." And the teacher said, "Well, that won't do, of course. We'll call you Susie." Now, the reaction, the characterization or perception today is how culturally imperialistic and destructive. And I'm not saying that that is wrong, but I actually think that it is partially a wrong interpretation. It was an effort to make an immigrant part of America as much as it was to erase the difference. We now celebrate difference, but up until my lifetime in America, one shouldn't have any hyphenated American. There were no Indian, there should not be, in the ideal of the narrative I'm trying to start to describe, an Indian American or a Chinese American or any other kind of American but an American. And the belief was, and there's a lot of power to this following conviction, was that if a society didn't have a coherent, unified cultural narrative and parameters, the society could not succeed or continue. It would break apart. With the increasing multi-ethnicity of America and the recognition of the rights of any individual and group to speak the language it wishes and live culturally as it wishes, we now celebrate diversity rather than unity. We claim to find, and often can, unity in diversity, but remember the logo on the American seal, which is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now it's while having many, one or something, a variation. In any event, let's go back 400 years and to my story about a narrative. So I'll tell the foundations of the narrative, which truly did has and continues to define what it is to be an American, what we all view, wherever we live, as American culture and American ideals. But remember that it is reductionist. But of necessity, any characterization of reality must be reductionist because we can't perceive the completeness of the complexity of life. So we have to simplify. So let me get to
Or
the
nature.
facts.
Or nature.
Or nature. Well, the humans and nature, I was trying to get to a Zen or a Buddhist concept, seriously, transcendental one, which is very important to the American narrative, actually, which is that we as individuals are merely, but it's something to be very fulfilled from being an infinitesimal part of the whole, but part of the whole, not inconsequential because infinitesimal. So, in any event, we all know that Columbus discovered for the West, for the Europeans, the America in 1492. And for almost 100 years, the
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
ocean blue. No longer in vogue to recite this poem, but we are dated and old. For almost 100 years, the Americas were largely the province, the exclusive domain of Spain, but Spain was to the south, and so not directly part of the story. The English came late to the story,
Party.
to the party, along with the French. They
Initially,
were
to be fair, initially they were stealing. They were privateers, basically privates, stealing Spanish silver or eights from Spanish galleons coming from the New World to the Old World. And unbeknownst to most people, a third of the silver that flowed into the Iberian Peninsula ended up in China, leading eventually to inflation, leading eventually to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty, particularly when in 1580 they decided to make silver the only currency, the only valid currency, and started collecting taxes even from poor farmers in silver. So the New World played right from the outset a much greater role in the Old World than people believe. In fact, chilies, which are staple fare in India, went from the New World, as did tomatoes and potatoes and whatnot.
Yeah, well, you're in my existence in a certain sense as part of a global community and certainly of the West is really because of China. I mean, in a sense, America and India are the products, at least as they are today, the products of the search by Europeans be able to benefit from the wealth of the trade with China, which was the leading civilization in the world.
China and India, actually, it was spices too. Columbus was looking for a route to India and he thought he'd reached India. So it was spices from India, which of course the Europeans needed pepper because otherwise you'd eat bland crap.
But we continue
And
to. At least I do. As a good descendant of Englishmen, I continue to eat bland things where pepper once a month is the wildest spice I probably dare. No, but we can blame, frankly, the Muslims and the Ottomans for all of this because
1453, the
since
collapse of Constantinople,
since they
which
conquered
triggers a
Constantinople,
price hike
yeah,
in spices, and then that triggers the exploration towards the east.
find a way around the now blocked Silk Route and trade routes. And so the Europeans did find a way literally around and discovered America. So that was the initial impulse to discover what led to the discovery of America and led to its settlement then 120 years later, 30 years later by the English was really at first to reestablish links with China and its wealth. So in the early 1600s, England was struggling with its own. It didn't have the religious wars that as quite as badly as Germany and France, but it really did. And for several hundred years, the driving political dynamic in England was really the struggle between Catholics and Protestants for control of the crown and the country. And
So, Glenn, if I can jump in and paint for our listeners a very, very, very rough sketch of religious wars in Europe, what happened after the age of exploration very quickly was, or at the same time, was a renaissance. And during the renaissance, of course, there was a birth, a rebirth of classical learning, yada yada, but it also meant that the church started spending a lot of money patronizing artists. And in 1517, a troublesome monk called Martin Luther nailed 95 theses on the church door of Wittenberg. And once that happened, all hell broke loose, and the Protestant Reformation or the Protestant Revolution was in full sway. Soon it became bloody. Religion, as Glenn and I constantly say, is an even bigger driver of human action than sex, believe it or not, at least at a collective level. And Europeans were soon slaughtering each other in the name of Jesus Christ, a good Palestinian Jew. Anyway, a long story
to the
short,
point where one third the population of Europe was killed in religious wars in the 1500s.
yeah, of continental. And in England, of course, this wasn't as bad. And in England, of course, the Church of England wasn't born because of theological, Germanic, doctrinaire thinking, but it was born out of the loins of Henry VIII. Henry VIII decided that out goes Pokely, plump Catherine of Spain, and in comes slim and sexy Anne Boleyn.
The wonderful innovation of Henry VIII marrying sex with religion.
We have to thank him indeed. Anyway, so Henry VIII breaks away from Rome, declares himself to be the head of the church, and wants to keep everyone on the straight and narrow of the Church of England, which is neither crazy Protestant, unlike Martin Luther or Calvin, John Calvin of Geneva. The Scots follow John Calvin, but the English are reasonable sorts. So they keep the straight and narrow, they keep some of the Catholic practices, they don't go crazy Protestant, and of course the king or the queen becomes head of church, and the younger sons of lords start becoming clergymen. However, even within England, the Catholics want to make a comeback, and even within England, there are those for whom the revolution does not go far enough, and they are influenced by the continent, they are Puritans, and of course they will triumph later in a civil war. Oliver Cromwell come to power, but that'll be a short-lived affair, but we are jumping the gun. In brief, religion kicks off a struggle for power and violence that rages across Europe for a century and a half. Over to you, Glenn.
Right. Well, which gets us to the subset, but central to the story of America, of the struggle among Protestant sects. So once this is the crisis of the West, and the triumph of the West is the triumph of the individual. And once an individual is empowered to make his or her own decisions, to interpret the Bible directly without the guidance of clergy, then who is to say that Atul has the truth or that Glenn Carl has the truth? Well, we both can say we do. And you then have this burgeoning of divergent views, and specifically in this context of the Bible, and thus you have different sects. This is why there are 116,000 different sects of Protestantism, because everyone is compelled to, in order to be a good Christian, to interpret the Bible and commune directly with God through the Bible, rather than through a hierarchy, through a diocese or a church. Thus, you have the Puritans who say, well, Henry VIII.
So the Protestant Reformation is like nuclear fission. There's no end to it.
No, there's no end. No, there isn't. That absolutely correct. So that gets to the Puritans who said, well, Henry VIII really hasn't, as Atul touched upon, hasn't gone far enough in breaking away from the decadence and the icon worship, idolatry of Catholicism, and so we will have our own sect. We will purify Christianity of all of these excrescences and diversions into avarice and opulence and so on. And of course, that's a threat to the power of the throne, which was the Church of England under Henry VIII. And so the Puritans were persecuted. Thus, what happens? Either they had to accept the Church of England, or they would be jailed or killed, or they would flee. So many of them fled to Holland. These are the Puritans. Among them, some among them my ancestors, and then they thought, well, the reach of England is great, and they're coming after us here in Holland. One of my direct ancestors, who was the only university graduate on the Mayflower, William Brewster, was in Holland. He was a printer, unwisely, because he printed scurrilous tracts against the Church of England and Henry and King Charles, and there was a warrant issued for his arrest and for others. And so they thought, "Gosh, where are we going to go?" The second element in the decision of the Puritans, the Pilgrims, to leave Holland, who had just left England a decade before, was that their children were assimilating into Dutch society, and they wanted their children to be English. So the New World existed. It was consciously in the minds of the people, and entrepreneurs saw a way to make a buck. That's a crass way to put it. They were seeking profits and business opportunities in setting up plantations and in lumber. Much of the timber for the Royal Navy for the following 250 years came from North America after the settlement by the English. And so they organized a company to find people willing to go to America and on contract to earn money for the business association that was financing the operation. This is the Mayflower group. And in return, after a number of years of essentially indentured servitude, they would be free and clear and own the land and have a new life, safe from the reach of the government of England. And so in 1620, they set off. There had been, before I get to the Mayflower, because it's relevant and it's a wonderful story. They're told more in Virginia than known nationally. The Mayflower story is known more so. In 1607, 13 years before the arrival of the Pilgrims, Mayflower, there was the Jamestown colony in what's now Virginia. And these were a bunch of young, sometimes noblemen, cavaliers, upper class sort, who found that work was beneath them. Seriously, workers worked and they served me, the Lord. So 100 of them went in 1607. They chose a ground that was malaria ridden, and they refused to farm. They didn't know how to fish, and they were all starving. And the Indians thought this is literally true. In Chesapeake Bay, in Jamestown, there's this colony of about 100 English men, and the fish are jumping out of the water just off the shore. Literally, you can see the fish jumping. And yet the men were starving. And the Indians around them thought, what are these people doing? They're complete idiots. They're hopeless, which is correct. And I'm giving a slightly colored interpretation, but not wrong. And the English would trade with the local Indian tribes, but they also stole from them, treated them as subhuman, didn't do nice things to the women. And so the Indians became hostile. The men in Jamestown were encircled, trapped, because if they stepped out, they would be killed for having been so terrible. And they were starving because they refused and didn't know how to do anything to maintain their subsistence. A not quite a rescue ship, but a ship with supplies and more settlers in 1609 called the Sea Venture was sent to Jamestown. And on it was a man named Stephen Hopkins, who was my great times 8 or 9 grandfather, of whom I have many. And the ship foundered in what is now Bermuda. Bermuda was uninhabited, and the crew, the passengers were all fortunate that they managed to get onto Bermuda before the ship completely sank, and so they all survived, but they're stuck on this desert island, as it were. And they spent a year there. They spent the fall, winter, and spring there. And it was a paradise, really. And they built a ship out of the local wood and the remains of the Sea Venture, and they sailed to Bermuda. But before they did that, the terms of the contract for the settlers was
They
that
sailed back to Britain, not to Bermuda. They sailed from Bermuda back to Britain, back to England. Correct?
no, 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 they did not. No, but this is part of the story, and it's relevant to the
So,
Mayflower
so they were in Bermuda. They were shipwrecked in Bermuda,
in
and
Bermuda.
and
Yes,
in Bermuda. And where did they sail to from Bermuda?
right. They built a ship, and that's so the captain. There was a governor with these are with patents from the crown, King of England, saying, when you arrive in Virginia, you, sir, are the
So they
governor.
sailed
Here's
to
your charter.
Virginia. They sailed to Virginia,
Yes, they
basically
sailed to
from
Virginia,
Bermuda. Yeah.
and while at sea, the captain, of course, is in charge. While once you arrive in Virginia, then the governor is in charge. I mentioned this. This will sound irrelevant, but it's directly relevant to the Mayflower, and here's why. So the passengers, the survivors, liked Bermuda, and they were largely free. They were not essentially serfs or indentured to the governor. And when it came time, when the ship was ready and they were about to sail off to Virginia the following spring, my ancestor, Stephen Hopkins, said, the terms of the charter say that you are in charge of me, Captain, when we're at sea, and that you, Governor, are in charge of us when we are in Virginia. But we are neither at sea nor in Virginia, so I'm not going to do what you say, and I'm staying. And he convinced a number of other passengers to stay in Virginia. And they said, well, that's mutiny. We're in charge of you, and I'm the captain of the ship, and I'm the governor of the colony, and you have to come. And he says, well, but no, the terms say that, we aren't in Virginia, we aren't at sea, so you cannot tell me what to do. The response was to take some of the crew, the captain and the governor took part of the crew, and they arrested my ancestor and charged him for mutiny and were stringing him up because he was mutinous. As he was about to be hanged, some other members of the party, of the passengers and the crew members, they said, he has a family, and Stephen Hopkins is begging that he says, I have a wife and children back in London. You can't do this to me. And his mates said, oh, let him off. You don't kill him. I mean, reprimand him, and he'll promise to be good. And astoundingly, the governor agreed and spared him. So they then get, this will be relevant. They then get to, they sail off to Virginia, and they find that they actually encounter the ship leaving Virginia because everyone had given up. They figure either we die here or we can try to get back to England. But the governor arrives. He says, no, I have the patent from the king. We will go back to Jamestown. Stephen Hopkins spent that winter there and said, oh, this is not for me. There was a better life there in Bermuda. And he managed to get on a fishing boat that went up to Newfoundland and back to England, where he returned to the tavern that he owned. He was a tavern keeper for a decade. The tavern was near where the financiers of the Mayflower worked. I believe that's how he came to be part of the Mayflower group. So 10 years later, this group thought, well, we will try again. We will do better. We will not have only cavaliers who wield swords but do nothing. We'll have people who actually can survive and thrive and earn us some money.
So you mean they decided they wouldn't have toffs like David Cameron, Boris Johnson coming?
Oh, it's certainly not Boris Johnson. Yeah, yeah. No, no. Yeomen survive and aristocrats pontificate, apparently. So not just apparently. And
So you're of good yeoman
so they found
stock.
100. That's right. The financiers found, and the pilgrims, the Puritans, and the Puritans found the financiers as a way to escape the oppression of and the reach of the English government that was going to arrest them. And so 110 or so sailed to Plymouth in 1620. I know this is longer than it should be. I'm sorry, but it is a fascinating story. So they arrived after many tribulations. They were aiming to go to New York, which was Dutch, but they figured, well, we'll just take it to simplify. But they missed, and they were 300 kilometers up the coast, and they hit what is now part of Massachusetts, right where I live. And the captain understandably said, we're out of provisions. There are no charts. This is very dangerous. this is it. I cannot continue any further. So you have to get off here. So they did. And after a little searching, they settled in what became Plymouth Colony. Now, why is it relevant, the tale about the sea venture and my ancestor, Stephen Hopkins? Well, two things happened. When he made it back to London in 1610, the captain of the ship had also returned. The captain of the ship wrote a memoir, which was unpublished, but it came into the hands of a man named William Shakespeare, who read this incredible tale of shipwreck, deserted island, mutiny, and then salvation. And that fall, he wrote The Tempest, in which Stephen Hopkins, my ancestor, figures as a drunken malcontent who plots to kill the king, which was essentially true. He was mutinous. So the Tempest comes out of my ancestor's mutiny. Listen, this is literally true. Literally true. And the Plymouth colony signs him on to be a member. Why? He was one of the few people alive who had actually been to the Americas and returned. So he had experience with Indians, and he knew something of the New World. Well, that was true, and I suppose something is infinitely more than zero background, but that was his background. And he was clearly an enterprising sort of guy.
But he didn't know that much, Glenn. He didn't know that much. He just spent a winter in Jamestown and gone back.
A winter, well,
Yeah.
that's right. But no one else had spent anything. No one else had, other than 100 useless cavaliers who couldn't fish. There had been no one. That's not true. There are many, many fishermen, English fishermen and French fishermen, who had been off the coast for many years. But that's a different thing. So they arrived here in Massachusetts in 1620. Something critical happened 3 years before their arrival. A French whaling ship foundered off the coast of Cape Cod, not far from here, not even 100 kilometers from here, 50 kilometers from here. 20 of the crew survived. They immediately got into a battle with the local Indian tribe, who killed 15 of them, captured 5, and enslaved them. Unfortunately, one of those 5 had what appears to have been smallpox. I think it was smallpox, which the Native Americans had no exposure to. And so for the following 3 years, from what is now Canada to what is now New York City, a coastline of 2,000 kilometers, I suppose, 1,500 kilometers, 90% of the Indian population died from this epidemic in the following 3 years. So when the Pilgrims arrived here in 1620, they found huge fields of farms, and abandoned villages, and virtually no one. The few Indians who had survived, the 10%, there was a local tribe here in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they were, the Indians are not saints any more than anyone else, and they had various rivalries and wars with neighboring tribes, and the local tribe had been decimated, more than decimated. Decimated means 1 out of 10 is killed. 90% had been killed. And they saw the English potentially as a useful tool in their power struggles, as an ally who could provide guns and manpower. And so they let them survive. Thus was founded what became America. Now, in 1620. Now, culturally, we touched upon why is that significant? What is this? What is the narrative? The narrative that has defined America is that it is fundamentally English culturally, Protestant, with the center of its value system on the individual and individual choice, and that authority is to be doubted, challenged, not
Questioned.
questioned. Thank you. Questioned, and that the lowest person, even in a highly structured hierarchical class society as 17th century England was, nonetheless, the tinker, the tailor, the candlestick maker's voice is fundamentally the equal to that of the king, which is subversive revolutionary and the foundation of the modern world, which really is from the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance prior even to the Reformation, and for the white man. Of course, but that was universal in the globe, really. That males dominated. The church was religion was central. The state was to be deferred to, except here, which is critical. Here being America, and that the indigenous inhabitants didn't count. They were not part of the narrative. They might the progressive Americans or Englishmen or Europeans thought possibly you can accept them if they assimilate. The conservative view was no, they are intrinsically different and frankly not equal humans, if human at all. And so that is what shaped America.
Just if I may jump in, the late John Bruton, who was Prime Minister of Ireland and a wonderful soul, he was advisor to Fair Observer, he said something similar to you. He said that, look, the Catholic Church was horrific, but at least the Indians had souls, which is why more natives survived south of the Rio Grande than north of it. Because for the pilgrims who came on the Mayflower, the natives, the Native Americans, the Indians, didn't even have souls ipso facto. It was all right to just exterminate them as mosquitoes.
Well, I think that's a little. I think that's a little unfair. It's true. The way of war, the English American way of war was essentially one of extermination. And that has been the case with America. In our history, we have total victory rather than the dirty European compromises of exchanging one province for another to end the war kind of thing. No, we must kill all the Nazis. We must bomb all the Japanese to, non-existence. But that only came as a result of what was perceived an existential threat. But
How did that work out in Afghanistan and Iraq?
well, no, I'm not saying that it triumphed, but it is always, one size never fits all. But let's not jump into Iraq, America's location. Yeah, that's 400 years ahead. But it wasn't a policy of extermination. Actually, it was one of cohabitation and and then possible assimilation by the progressive Puritans early in the 17th century until there really was a power struggle. And I would argue the Indians rightly, and this is 50 years later in the 1670s now, realized that their choice was either we eliminate the English or we die. There is no alternative because, as you touched upon, the property is the foundation of civilization, frankly, for the West, is utterly alien to the Indian. And there are a host of other differences. And so they had no choice. But the Indians realized, well, we cannot truly defeat the English. This is in the 1670s, now 50 years later. But they thought, well, we have a choice. We can try or we die. It's better to try than to die. That I think, in a grossly reductionist way, was the choice the Indians faced. And the English in the 1670s in Massachusetts and Connecticut here had expanded hugely past the 110 or so who had arrived with Stephen Hopkins, my ancestor, and William Brewster, my ancestor. And they viewed the Indians as we have talked about, a biblically existential threat, as sort of the forces of the devil, ultimately, and in the way, others who were more cynical. And then there were two mediocre leaders. One, King Philip for the Indians, that was what he was called, and one, shoot, the name slips my mind for now, but the governor of the Massachusetts colony, who lived only 5 kilometers from my house here. And they both made the standard mistakes that average humans make in impossible situations of command and leadership. And it led to what's called King Philip's War, which was a war of extermination, in which 20% of the white English population was killed, but the Indians were essentially exterminated over a hideous war. But it wasn't purely because the English, the colonists, the pilgrims, invariably and from the get-go thought we must exterminate them. There are a series of sort of unavoidable tragic circumstances that added up to the same thing. But it initially wasn't a plan. There wasn't a plan. And for 50 years, there was relatively good cohabitation. So that founded, the Pilgrims can be viewed as, well, that was in the first half of the 1600s, only a few hundred people. That's only Massachusetts, et cetera. How is that relevant at all to what America is, which is now Indian American and Chinese American and English American and so on? Well, because it very clearly set the cultural, social, political framework that shapes thought and what is right and wrong with respect to an individual's comportment, the organization of society, and the structure of government up to today until.
It is the DNA. It is the foundational DNA of America, and it has both good and bad. It is not just both good and bad. It is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And 50 shades of grey, if not at least 50 shades of grey, actually 1,000 shades of grey. And one of the things that you jump to King Philip's War, but before that we have in our conversations discussed the war with the Pequot Indians in Rhode Island.
Pequot War. That was the first war. That was a war of extermination. And it was an understandable war.
Yeah. No man, woman, or child was spared in that war. Everyone was slaughtered en masse.
That's right. That's right. That was, if we want to talk about that, 1620 is when the Mayflower arrived. And in 1636, there was, at that point, Massachusetts, which is now Boston, had also been settled. And the Pequot Indians who lived in what is now Rhode Island, about 120 kilometers to the south, got into a series of disputes with, we'll call them the English. I don't go into too much detail. And the fear was that unless we respond strongly, they will form a coalition, and we'll not only be, we, the English of Boston and Plymouth, will not only be boxed in, but our existence is in danger. That was the sincere belief. I think with some foundation, but gross simplification, certainly with the hindsight of history. And even some then thought so. So the English went to war against the Pequot tribe with the alliance of a number of other Indian tribes who had their own arguments with the Pequot. And so they marched on the Pequot nation, which is in what is now Rhode Island. And when the English forced the Pequot to battle, essentially trapping them, it was going to be a great victory for the alliance of the English with the other Indian tribes. However, for Indians, the war was usually not a war of extermination, although it was for the Iroquois to the west, but it was a war to expand your power, delineate boundaries of hunting grounds, reestablish honor, but not to kill everybody. And the English, in this frenzy of anger and fear, killed the entire tribe, all of them, about 800 people, I think it was. And those who survived, they enslaved and sailed off to the West Indies, and they were never heard from again because they probably all died in transit. So that's true. That the first war was the Pequot War in 1636, and that was a war of extermination. And there were then 40 years of relative harmony, and then a hideous war, King Philip's War, also. And from then on, things were always tense, I guess you can say fairly. But what came out of all of this is what I said a moment ago, was very clearly what until recently recent generation was characterized as the Anglo-Saxon cultural approach to social organization, which is individual rights, Protestant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant the WASP culture that defined America, and you can argue still continues to define America, even though there seem to be no or hardly any WASPs on the Supreme Court. It's all Catholics and Jews now, but still, culturally, Culturally, you could argue they are waspy,
Uh, yeah, I think
or
for
some
the
of them at
average,
least.
for most people on Earth, that would be a true statement. That would be an accurate statement. For but hatreds are always deepest with those with whom you are closest. So um, I would challenge perhaps that they have embraced sufficient WASP values in some instances. But okay,
They're not wasp enough. They don't have ancestors on the Mayflower.
that's correct. That is correct. You could say that. I'm no longer allowed to say that. That is correct. But that was a very long-winded, in some ways, in now forgotten detail, but critically important detail to how we came to have what became the United States and Canada too, as this Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, and what it means, and how there's one other element. Oh, that's very, very important, and why I had mentioned Stephen Hopkins and his mutiny and his almost being hanged and the Tempest. So let me jump back one moment. As the Mayflower ship was off the coast of what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts, and just before it stopped, disembarked the Pilgrims here in the Plymouth area, they thought, well, we are not landing where the charter extends, the same circumstance that had happened 10 years before to the Sea Venture in Bermuda. And so our charter does not apply. And there are two kinds of passenger on this ship. There are the true pilgrims who are coming for Puritans rather, who are coming for religious purposes and who buy into the society structure that we are going to try to build. And there are what were called the adventurers. Half of the pilgrim passengers, Mayflower passengers, were people like Stephen Hopkins, my ancestor, and they were just people seeking a better life. They were not religiously motivated. Half or more of the Mayflower contingent. And who was on the Mayflower? Not only half of them were these adventurers who were not religiously pure enough and didn't buy into the compact of Puritan values and religious values and so on, but was one Stephen Hopkins, who was a known mutineer, who had almost destroyed everything before and had been condemned to hang. And so the leaders of the Mayflower on the ship and of the community on board, the passengers, said, we have to have a formal compact to shape how we will be governed and what the rules are. And they wrote on board the Mayflower Compact. The last person who signed it, no, that's not true. That's another tale. But they obliged everyone to sign it, among whom was Stephen Hopkins, the mutineer. And it was the Mayflower Compact, in part, was consciously done to try to control and bound the behavior of this half of the passenger group, the pilgrims, who were neither Puritan nor accepted the rules and were known, in Stephen Hopkins' case, to have been mutinous and not sufficiently respectful of authority. And the Mayflower Compact is viewed as the precursor to the American Declaration of Independence and the foundation of government by the people, of the people, and for the people, in Abraham Lincoln's terminology. It's the critical, central political philosophy basis of what became American government and society. It derives out of the Reformation, out of the struggles between the Church of England and the Puritans, and specifically out of the mutiny of one Stephen Hopkins 10 years before in the Sea Venture, about which Shakespeare wrote. And then, because half the passengers were of similar independent, irreligious mind to Stephen Hopkins. And that's why the Mayflower Compact was written. And it became truly critical to what America is today.
Brilliant. On that happy note, we will pick up on the story of America in our next podcast. There's a lot to unravel, a lot to learn. And thank you very much for your time, Glenn. See you very soon.
I don't know how to say in proper 17th century English. It's been a pleasure.